Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our ASEAN Corporate Secretaries Network webinar on the future of board evaluation. Today, we have with us Mr. Philip Mackey, an associate with Linstock in London, the firm that practices board evaluation. Unfortunately, Mr. Oliver Zain, who's a partner, is unable to join us this afternoon. But we can be well assured that with the vast experience under his belt with the firm, Philip will be able to share with us what board evaluation is like and what the future holds for us as company secretaries and whether we can participate in this. I'm now going to stop sharing this slide and hand over the time to Philip. So do allow some time for the handover as we use the internet.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Tan. Can I just confirm that you can see the slides okay?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for tuning in to this session on the future of board evaluation. And thank you also to Prof. Tan and to the ACSN for organising the event. And what better way to start your weekend than talking about board evaluation. So I think we have about an hour in total. And just to expand upon what Prof. Tan said with regard to who we are and why we're talking about board evaluation. So Linstock is an advisory firm based in London, and we specialise in helping boards with their evaluations. That's all we do as a firm. We probably conduct about 100 board evaluations a year all over the world, including for some big companies in Southeast Asia. Now, we also recently completed a big research project on the subject of board evaluations, and that was entitled 15 Years of Reviewing the Performance of Boards. And I think if you get in touch with your contacts at the ACSN, they will be able to provide you with a copy of this study. It's called 15 Years because it's been 15 years since the practice of board evaluations was formally introduced into the UK Corporate Governance Code. And this study that we conducted received input from over 350 board members and company secretaries from big multinational companies. I don't think there has ever been a study like this on this subject. We then hosted a number of workshops and roundtables all over the world, and these were attended by hundreds of company secretaries to discuss the findings of the study. And so what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is just present on some of the key themes that came out of the study and those subsequent discussions, and tell you a little bit about how we at Linstock, but also our clients, see the practice of board evaluations evolving in the coming years. Now, some of you may have attended our workshops in Hong Kong and in Singapore last year on how to conduct a board evaluation. Today's session is going to be a bit more high level and forward looking, but we do have a lot of time for questions, so please feel free to ask anything on the more basic practicalities of conducting a board evaluation if that's going to be more useful to you. Now, the first thing I want to kind of highlight on this subject is that generally, in our experience, board members are overwhelmingly positive about the value of board evaluations. And you can see the graph on this slide presents one of the key findings from our study, which is that over 80% of board members and company secretaries in our research felt that board evaluations have a positive impact on the performance of their board. Now, last year when I was in Southeast Asia, I spoke to quite a number of company secretaries who were struggling to convince their boards about the value of self-reviewing their performance. And if you are in that position, just point them to this statistic. The boards of many of the biggest and the most successful companies in the world are seeing real value from this exercise. And below the chart, I've included a short list, the 3 most commonly mentioned benefits that our study respondents are getting from their evaluations. So firstly, improving the board's focus and agreeing on priorities. Secondly, raising issues, and often these are quite sensitive issues, and prompting open discussion on those issues. And then thirdly, improving the dynamics of the board and engagement between board members and between the board and management. Now, in my experience working with a small number of companies in Southeast Asia, I think there is still some resistance to the concept of board evaluations. Overall, having worked in this area for 6 or 7 years now, I think they are becoming more established and a more valued part of the board's calendar, particularly in big Southeast Asian companies. And I've certainly seen the process become more sophisticated in recent years, moving away from a very compliance-focused, tick-the-box approach and becoming more business-focused and forward-looking in their nature. And you, as company secretaries, have an absolutely key role to play in keeping this subject on the board's agenda and promoting the value of regular self-evaluation. And we'll come back to what role the company secretary can play in the board evaluation in a few minutes when we come to the Q&A session. Now, looking forward in terms of the future of board evaluations, the first issue I'd like to consider is who actually participates in the exercise. Now, for most companies and for most of you who have completed a board evaluation, participation is still restricted to board members, and if you're lucky, the company secretary. But we are increasingly seeing other senior internal stakeholders being invited to provide input on the board's performance, and that's something that I think will become more prevalent in the future. Now, we actually asked a question on this subject in the study, and you can see the graphical output on the slide in front of you. And you can see that it's increasingly common to include board and committee attendees in the evaluation. And that's attendees. So that will typically be members of non-board level management who have regular interaction with the board and with specific committees. Now, in our experience, this is a very effective way of getting valuable feedback on the board's performance. Boards can sometimes be a bit insular, and it risks being a bit self-congratulatory. So by inviting feedback from non-board members, asking them about the level of support and the level of challenge that they receive from the board, this can give the board a very valuable perspective on their performance. But you have to be careful that it's not always something that the board is comfortable with, and you have to really consider how you position this with the chair. But in our experience, sophisticated, mature boards should welcome feedback from the people who report to them. Now, a very interesting development in the United Kingdom this year has been that we have a new corporate governance code, which is coming into force next year. And we also have guidance on board effectiveness that was released by our corporate governance regulator. And there's been a real focus in this guidance on the board's accountability to both internal and external stakeholders. And the guidance actually suggests that the board evaluation ought to include the views of people beyond the boardroom. And they give some examples of these stakeholders being big shareholders, regulators, even external advisors like your external auditor taking part in the audit committee review, for example. The guidance also states that the chairman of the board ought to consider ways in which to obtain feedback from the workforce on the performance of the board and individual directors. Now, this is a very controversial recommendation that fostered quite a lot of discussion in our breakfast seminars, and it will be quite interesting to hear your views on that subject when we come to the discussion in 10 minutes or so. Now, some of you may be aware that in certain European countries, boards actually include employee representatives. So we do quite a lot of work in Sweden and Norway, for example, and those boards have maybe 2 or 3 employee representatives sitting on the board. So when we evaluate those boards' performance, it's very normal for us to consider the views of the workforce in those exercises. But otherwise, it's actually very rare. And for the first time recently, as a direct result of this new guidance, which has come into force in the UK, we were asked to invite senior members of a company's workers' council to complete a survey on the performance of the board. And so we asked those individuals on the workers' council how well the board understands employee concerns and how responsive do they feel the board are to employee concerns. Now, this is a very new initiative. We are still waiting to see how it develops. But looking forward to the future of board evaluations, I think we will see board evaluations incorporate the views of a wider range of stakeholders. And maybe in the first instance, that might just be key internal executives. But we do expect that to become more prevalent in the coming years. You do have to be really careful, though, if you are inviting people who don't sit on the board to comment on board performance. You have to be careful that they actually have enough exposure to the board and enough of an understanding of the board to actually have a valuable opinion on the board's performance. Now, the second slide here covers both the timing of the board evaluation and the scope of the board evaluation. And timing is quite an interesting point, because I think it's something that the boards often don't consider. Typically, the board evaluation will be completed towards the end of the year, and it almost acts as a backward-looking review of the past 12 months. And that's actually not ideal. There are so many other things competing for the board's attention at that time of the year. You know, there are so many other priorities that the board evaluation may not get the attention it deserves. And clients of ours are increasingly reflecting on when the optimal time to complete the evaluation is. Now, for example, it's very common these days for boards to have some sort of offsite earlier on in the year. And that might be a day or two outside of the boardroom where directors visit one of the company sites, and that might be in the country or overseas. Now, increasingly, we are seeing clients conduct their board evaluations in the aftermath of a collective board experience like that. And it's actually very interesting to engage the board to reflect on their performance in the context of a recent event. And that can actually add extra depth to the review and often results in greater alignment on the board. Now, what we're going to see in future, I think, is boards being a little bit more flexible with regard to the timing of the board evaluation and when in the corporate calendar the review takes place. So scheduling the review around key events and decisions rather than sticking to a firm timetable and doing the board evaluation as the year-end approaches. Now, the second point on this slide is around the scope of the evaluation. And in future, we expect to see boards be a bit more innovative in terms of the areas that they address in the board review. Now, commonly in Southeast Asia, we will see reviews typically covering the classic governance headings. You know, it's board composition, board meetings, board papers, and so on. The problem is if you only address these issues every single year, it risks being rather repetitive for the directors, and the value of the exercise risks being called into question. So increasingly, we are seeing reviews being focused on specific themes. It may be strategic oversight, it may be oversight of culture in the organization. We are seeing deep dives into key decisions that the board has made. That might be a chief executive appointment or a major acquisition. And we're also seeing case studies which are driven by what has been going on in the company and where the board's attention has been focused. And you can see on the graph on this slide, which again is taken from our study, that the most common event to review is the strategy. key appointments and key transactions also being fairly common, and case studies being the least common method here. But there are really a couple of important reasons why something like a case study can be beneficial. Firstly, it helps you understand how the board performed when it wasn't just business as usual, when they were really under pressure and they were tested. And usually there are lessons that the board can learn for the future from these experiences. But also something like a case study is just simply more interesting and engaging for your directors. And you have to bear in mind that some of your directors will be doing several evaluations at different companies throughout the year, and it risks being, I think, rather tiresome for them. So using very specific case studies that are relevant to your company can be a very powerful mechanism to capture their attention. So I think the third trend we're going to see in the future is greater diversity with regard to the issues that are being addressed in board evaluations beyond those classic governance headings, and also more change year on year with regard to content. Now, in the final slide here, before we move on to Q&A, I just want to touch upon external facilitation of board evaluations, and also how to disclose your board evaluation in the annual report. And these are two areas where I think you're going to see a lot of developments in the coming years. Now, with regard to external facilitation, I know that many, certainly bigger companies in Southeast Asia, are already engaging external facilitators, but I think that's something that will become more prevalent and will trickle down to smaller companies in the coming years. And this is a global trend. This is something that we are seeing all over the world, whether it's Canada or Australia, but more and more companies are going to see the value in engaging an independent third party to help out with the board evaluation. And in many countries, it's become quite standard practice to engage an external facilitator once every 3 years. In fact, in the British corporate governance codes, big companies are actually required to do this. And I just want to draw your attention to a statistic in our study, which shows that 2/3 of respondents stated that even if there was no requirement in the corporate governance code for them to do so, they would still undertake an external board evaluation every 3 years. The other third of the respondents were not saying that they wouldn't do it. They were expressing a preference that perhaps 3 years is not the right timescale to look at this, and that maybe 5 years is more appropriate. But it's very encouraging, I think, particularly for a firm like Linstock, to see that the companies are getting real value from the expertise that is brought by external advisors in this area. And a trend that we have seen all across Europe and again in Canada and Australia are the big accounting firms and the big executive search firms, which used to conduct a lot of board evaluations, actually stepping away from this area, and more specialized firms entering the market. And I suspect that's something that maybe is or will happen in the coming years in Southeast Asian countries too. So I think in future you can expect to see a greater variety of individuals and specialist firms offering board evaluation services. And I think it's, as a company secretary, it's worth familiarizing yourself with these individuals and with these firms, so that when it does come to the stage when your board are interested in engaging an external party, you are in a good position to brief the chair and brief the board on the different approaches and the different methodologies of the different providers who are in the market. And then finally, I'll just touch on disclosing the board evaluation in the annual report, because certainly, again, in Europe and other geographies that we work in, there's growing demand, particularly from investors, but also from regulators and other external stakeholders, for more meaningful disclosure in the annual report in this area. So detailing not just the process that you went through, but also detailing, what came out of the review and how are the board going to deal with development areas. And it's very much about getting the balance right between making the annual report disclosure useful for readers, but also not disclosing too much that you're giving away confidential information. And I did have a look through the annual reports of some big companies in the region, and the disclosure does overall still remain quite high level and somewhat superficial. So I think in the coming years, you will see these annual report disclosures becoming more detailed and more insightful, and giving more information about how development areas are being addressed, and you know, what improvements have been made since the last year's evaluation. So just to recap on what I've covered over the past 10 or 15 minutes, the main trends that we see developing in the future are firstly, participation in the review extending beyond purely board members. Secondly, greater flexibility with regard to when the board evaluation is undertaken. Thirdly, greater innovation with regard to the subjects that are covered in the board evaluation. And then fourth, greater use of external facilitation and more specialist providers conducting board evaluations. And then finally, more comprehensive disclosures in annual reports. So I will finish up there, and I will hand back to Prof. Tan, and then we can open up for some questions.
Okay, thank you, Philip. There are 3 questions in the chat on the side. The first question is it a 1 board or 2 board system that you're talking about? This is from Yvonne Chandra, and I think this has got to do with the fact that in some countries you have a 2-tier board system with a supervisory board and a board. So in that context, would you still be talking about evaluation of both levels or just 1 level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to confirm that, that is not the case in any Southeast Asian countries, is it? Do you typically have unitary boards? Is that correct?
No, we have 2 tiers in Indonesia.
Okay. So we're very familiar with this. Again, coming back to the likes of Norway and Sweden and you know, Germany, Austria, these countries do typically have 2-tier boards where you have a supervisory board and then a management board beneath that. Typically, we will review the performance of the supervisory board. But again, this is another interesting trend that we're seeing, as more and more companies are also asking us to review the management board. But then there's also another technique called, well, we describe it as an upward review, where the management board will review the performance of the supervisory board. And this is a totally separate questionnaire where we are asking the management board about, for example, the atmosphere when they present to the supervisory board in meetings, whether they feel they get enough challenge and support from the supervisory board, whether they feel they're getting enough clarity on what the supervisory board want from them when they leave the meeting, and so on. So most of our work is conducted in the UK and Canada and Australia, where more commonly it's a unitary board. For me, that is my preferred structure, but it's also very common as well for us to help supervisory boards with their reviews.
The second question is, how do we evaluate the best size of board? How to evaluate that the board has met the diversity requirements? This is the future of
So I mean, certainly in the UK, there's a lot of information out there on board size. So some of the big executive search firms, for example, will publish research each year on corporate boards, and typically that research will contain information on board size. So averages and broken down by industry and size of company and so on. So I don't know if the similar type of research exists in Southeast Asia, if anyone is producing that, but it can be as simple as doing some of your own desktop research, looking at other similar companies and looking at their boards online, the smaller the company, that we would expect to have a smaller board. So you have to also bear in mind what type of company are you working for? Is it a complex organization that requires a lot of board members to sit on the committees, or is it a more simple organization that can have a smaller board? I think in the UK, the average board size for a very big company is around 10. And for me, that is the kind of the limit. I think when you start getting beyond 10 to 11, 12, 13, 14 people, it starts to become very difficult. I'm sure all of you can imagine sitting in a room with another 12 people, and whether you can have a very valuable, focused discussion in that environment is questionable. But I think if you're just looking at your own board and trying to judge whether it's the right size, you just do some of your own research, look at other similar companies and other similar boards, and if you are an outlier, if you have 2 or 3 more board members than most other companies, then that's maybe a discussion that you ought to have with the chair. And the kind of same response goes for board diversity as well. So there's a huge amount of research here in the UK, and if you want to have a look at it, it's called the Hampton-Alexander Review, and I'll maybe send this to the team afterwards. But this is a huge piece of research that's been done in the UK on diversity on boards, and there's almost a kind of ranking produced at the end of the year of the top 400 companies in the UK and where they rank in terms of diversity, both gender diversity but also ethnic diversity. And again, this is quite controversial because a lot of boards, I think quite rightly, aren't viewing diversity purely in terms of gender and ethnicity. I think boards as well ought to be considering the backgrounds that their board members come from. I mean, I did a board evaluation of a very big global financial services company recently. And if you looked at their board online, you would think that they are very diverse. They had 50% of the board was female. They had a third of the board being from non-white, ethnicity. But if you looked at the CVs and if you looked at the careers of these individuals, they had all been to Oxford or Cambridge University. They had all worked in the City of London in investment banking and insurance, and they were all of a very similar background. And so that is not true diversity. So when you are looking at the diversity of your own board, don't just look at gender, although it's very important, and don't just look at the ethnicity or the countries that your board members are coming from. Also look at their backgrounds, their education, their careers, because that is true diversity. And this is a subject that's increasingly addressed in our board evaluations, but it's something that is quite challenging to address directly. It's something we don't want to lead the witness, so to speak. So we will normally ask some general questions about composition. If board members do feel that there is a problem with either the size of the board or diversity, typically they will raise it with you. You don't always need to ask about it directly.
Okay, third question. You mentioned reviewing the board, conducting a board evaluation once in 3 years using an external consultant. Would this be effective if in the ever-changing world? Would it be necessary to do it in a shorter duration of time?
Yeah, and I think one of the good things about the practice of board evaluation is that there are no very prescriptive rules to what constitutes an external board review. And this is a very important thing to consider. There is no regulation which stipulates what an external board review involves. So a lot of our clients, for example, will do an externally facilitated review more often than just every 3 years, depending on their circumstances. But the external review may not necessarily involve a very in-depth, time-intensive, expensive process. So a lot of people associate an external review with board member interviews. So the external advisor coming in, meeting all the board members, and producing a report following that interaction. A lot of our clients, some of the biggest companies in the world, I mean, we have just conducted an external board evaluation for Shell, one of the biggest companies in the world, but this external board review did not involve director interviews. We guaranteed the anonymity of the directors. We asked them to complete a short survey. We did our own analysis and we presented a report back to the board and briefed the company secretary on the key issues. Now, for me, that constitutes an externally facilitated review because we have guaranteed guaranteed anonymity, and we have also delivered an independent report back to the board. So to answer the question, I think that yes, it's entirely appropriate, depending on the circumstances of your board, to engage an external party to help with your board evaluation more frequently than just every 3 years. But if you have to be careful, you do not want to expose your board to a very time-intensive, time-demanding external board review too often, because it risks being frustrating for them. So I think in terms of a big in-depth review, I think actually 3 years is probably sufficient. And some companies, as I mentioned in our study, are even pushing for that time horizon to be expanded to maybe 5 years. And again, I think companies should have the flexibility to do that. If there's nothing serious going on the board, if the company is operating well, if the board are functioning well, you could question whether it's a valuable use of the board's time and a valuable use of the board's money to engage an external party. And I think in those situations, boards should be free to perhaps delay an external review until a subsequent year and maybe increase the length of time between the external reviews. Alternatively, and we have a lot of experience with this, there may be a lot going on the board. There may be lots of challenges with dynamics. And in those situations, I think it's entirely appropriate for an external party to be engaged more frequently than every 3 years. And some of our clients, in fact, most of our clients, will engage us every single year to conduct their board evaluation.
While you're at this thing about, you just mentioned that you've been re-engaged more than once. The question is, do the external way to be rotated the same way that they rotate auditors after some time? What
No,
are
so
your views on
that's
that?
again, that's a really interesting point, and it's not something that is enforced in the UK. It's something that people have discussed, and it was a big topic of conversation in our breakfast seminars. And I think there's really two ways of looking at this. I can think of some of our clients that we have now worked for every single year for 12 years. And these are some very big companies. Now, from our perspective, we think that allows our work, that the surveys that we design, the interviews that we conduct, the reports that we generate, to be far more tailored to the needs of the company, because we know the company very well, we know the board very well. And as one of your attendees has mentioned, board members can change quite regularly, even after 3 years. So we have seen board members come and go. But having that familiarity with the board and having that familiarity with the company allows our advice and our recommendations to be, I think, far more high quality, because we know the board, we know the chairman, and we know the company really well. You can imagine you come for the first year to review the performance of a board. It's very challenging, actually, to get your head around the dynamics, to get your head around the different personalities on the board, and to truly understand the company. And therefore, the advice that you can offer can sometimes be somewhat limited. But if you have built up an understanding over the years of the company and the board, I think the advice you give can be even better. So, personally, as a firm, we are in favor of working with boards over several years for that reason. But also, we completely understand when boards elect to use a different provider every few years, perhaps to get a different perspective, perhaps because in 1 year a particular methodology or approach would have been appropriate, whereas in a subsequent year maybe something more light touch or something out of the ordinary would be more appropriate. So I think, again, it's all about boards being flexible and having the choice. I don't believe there should be any regulation or guidance which stipulates that external facilitators should be rotated. I think it's very much up to the company to decide whether they want to, and a lot of this comes down to trust. If a chairman and a board trust an external advisor, I think they should be allowed to keep working with them.
Right, there's one more question. Can you share about board evaluation for non-profits or charities? Is it the same or different?
Yeah,
If
no, that's another really good question. And again, this is something that we do a lot of. Where we can, we try to do charity and not-for-profit board reviews for free, so we don't charge for them. So you'll all be familiar, for example, with charities like Save the Children, which is a client of ours, and we do their board evaluation every single year for free. It's part of our charity initiative. And our view on that is that, well, a board is a board, whether it's a board overseeing a charity or a non-corporate organization, or it's a board that's overseeing a global multinational. It's still a group of people who receive information and make decisions. And as such, I think that the approach to the board evaluations should be similar and should still aim to achieve best practice. Now, undoubtedly, the kind of topics that you will address in the board evaluation will be different, because the stakeholders of a charity are very different to the stakeholders of a company. There are no shareholders, so the focus of the review will be quite different. You also have to acknowledge the fact that very often on charities and other not-for-profit organizations, board members are volunteers, so they are not being remunerated for their involvement, and so therefore it's perhaps not appropriate to ask too much about involvement outside of board meetings and this kind of thing, because these people are there as volunteers and not being paid. So certainly you have to tailor the content of the survey to the specific circumstances of the organization. But personally, when we are conducting a charity board review, we approach it in exactly the same way as we would approach a global multinational.
we have another question. How effective can this board evaluation be if we only use internal people to do the evaluation? Say, if the company secretary who's not trained in psychology or human resources were to attempt to do the board evaluation.
Okay.
Your views be on this?
Okay, so well, I mean, at Linstock, we are probably one of the leading providers of board evaluations in the world, and nobody at Linstock has any background in psychology or HR. What we do have experience with is working with board members, and that's exactly the same as the experience that company secretaries have. Company secretaries, nobody I think knows the organization and knows the board like a company secretary, and I think that is far more important than having a background in psychology. I mean, I wouldn't try to get too much into the psychology of a board, really. I think it's more about there is an element of dynamics there, but a lot of it is about process and the way in which meetings are managed, the papers that the board are receiving, and the board overseeing strategy and risk and succession planning. So I don't personally view a board evaluation as an exercise that requires a great deal of knowledge about psychology or human resources. What you need is an understanding of how boards work, how governance works, governance processes, governance systems, and that's something that company secretaries have more than anybody else.
Have you, this is the next question, I'm paraphrasing it for them. Have you ever encountered situations, or what will you do if the board were to use board evaluation to remove other board members for political agendas. I mean, you use something like that to get rid of people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's actually, in our experience, it's very common for boards to engage an external facilitator to conduct a board evaluation when they know that they either want to remove a chief executive or remove a chair. And that's because it's easier to get an external party to deliver this message than it is to have the discussion internally. And it is quite interesting, actually, if you look over the past few years, that the number of board evaluations that we have completed, the number of chief executives or chairmen who have subsequently in the years following the review left the company, and you look at the content of the review, and there were a lot of concerns raised in the board evaluation about the performance of the chief executive or the chair. So I think what you have to do in any board review is look at consensus. If there's consensus on the board that a particular member is not performing well, is not contributing to the board, and there's consensus that that individual ought to be removed, then ultimately you have to go with the consensus. So that this does happen. I think it's actually very common for the board evaluation to be used as a tool to make changes in composition. But there's, if there is alignment on the board that these changes need to be made, then it's very difficult to do anything about it, and you have to kind of work with the board on that.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question in general, which is also posed by the people listening in. What are the specific challenges that you faced? Some examples would be good in conducting the evaluation, and perhaps share who are the usual people who help the evaluation along.
Okay. In terms of challenges, I think probably the biggest challenge, and you have to look at this in the context in which we are working, in that it's been 15 years since the concept of board evaluations was introduced in the UK. So board members have been conducting a review every year for 15 years, and a lot of board members, as I mentioned earlier, sit on multiple boards. So these high-profile board members can be doing 4 or 5 board evaluations a year for 15 years. The risk is that an element of review fatigue creeps in, and the risk is that when we commence our evaluation, that board members don't really engage with the process. So the big challenge for us is getting that engagement, particularly when a board perhaps is somewhat skeptical about the concept and the idea of reviewing performance through the use of a survey. So the big challenge for us is making the content of the review engaging and getting board members to really participate and kind of make recommendations to the review. I made a few suggestions in the presentations as to different techniques that you can use to get that engagement, and that's through really just making sure the content, if you're using a survey, making sure the content of the survey is as tailored to the board as possible. So you want your board members to be able to look through a survey and see immediately that this refers to your organization, rather than just being a generic compliance survey. So I think getting engagement from directors is a real challenge. There are some board members, admittedly, who feel more comfortable engaging one-on-one in a conversation than they do in questionnaires. But equally, there are board members who prefer to put their thoughts down in writing in a survey than actually to meet in person. So again, a challenge is just judging what is the best approach. How are your board best going to engage with this process? Do you want to have conversations with them and maybe tease out some of the more sensitive issues through a verbal conversation, or do you think a survey is going to be more appropriate? But if you're going to use a survey, make sure it is as tailored to that board's requirements as possible.
Okay, there was a request for more materials to be shared by you, but we'll file that request with you privately, see
Okay,
whether you
that's fine.
accede to that.
Yep.
We did pose all those who are on the webinar 2 questions during the poll, and I'm going to just share the results
Okay.
with everyone. Okay, so the question, hang on, has it gone on to this? Not yet. Oh, it's not here, but it's. Do I have to share it here? Do I have to share my screen? Oh, you
Yeah,
share.
I can
Okay.
see it.
Okay, you can see it. All right. So, should the company secretary play an active role in the board evaluation process? You
Interesting.
have
Okay.
about 30%, 28.57% saying always, and then 40% saying very often. So if you take those two together, that's a high percentage. So the company secretary plays an active role in persuading. What they're talking about is the question. I'm curious.
Yeah.
In
So
your experience, what active role has the company?
Yeah, I've seen the role that company secretaries play in the board evaluation evolve, tremendously over the past, even just the past 5 years. So when I first started working in this area, very often I was engaging with company secretaries on an administrative level. So it was the company secretary who was perhaps dealing with the administrative side of the board evaluation, providing us with the directors' email addresses, helping to collate the responses and provide the surveys to the directors and so on. And over the years, what we've seen is company secretaries being far more involved, for example, in briefing us before the review takes place on what the key issues we ought to address are. We see the company secretary being the key individual that we are briefing post-review in terms of what the big themes that have come out of the review are. Ideally, I think the company secretary should also be a respondent to the exercise, and I think that's one of the other benefits of engaging an external party, is that the external facilitator takes the administrative burden away from the company secretary and frees the company secretary up to take part in the review as a respondent. Company secretaries have a very unique perspective of board performance, and I think they should be encouraged to participate in the review. Now, an interesting trend we have seen recently in some very big companies in the UK is actually, after the survey phase of the board evaluation has been completed, we produce a briefing note that goes to the company secretary to then facilitate one-on-one discussions between the company secretary and each of the board members. Now, that's something that we didn't see at all even 5 years ago, whereas now company secretaries are playing a far more influential role here. And I think it's because chairmen are kind of acknowledging that a board evaluation is essentially a review of the chair's performance, and so therefore it's not appropriate for the chairman to be directing the board evaluation. So we're seeing chairmen take a step back and elevate the role of the company secretary to be the individual who is really acting as the guardian of the board evaluation, and that's where I think all of your members and everyone attending today's session should be aspiring to. It may not be something that happens immediately, but in the next 5 to 10 years, that's where you should be aiming for.
Okay, the other. Let me see. Okay,
there's a question on individual evaluation, which is quite interesting. I see. And I'll maybe just touch on that, because that's something I haven't covered, and it's a very interesting and kind of somewhat controversial kind of part of the practice, because a lot of the codes, the corporate governance codes out there will say that it's not just a review of the board as a whole, but also individual performance ought to be considered as well. And in our experience, there's a few different ways in which you can do this. The most common way that we review individual director performance is actually through an individual self-review. So we are asking each board member to rate their own contribution to the board. So how well are you preparing for board meetings? How well are you actually engaging in discussions in board meetings? How well are you supporting, you personally supporting members of management? So it's a self-review, and then the results of that will typically go to the chair and the company secretary, so that it can facilitate any further one-on-ones or two-on-ones that they want to have with each of the directors on their performance. And that is the most, I suppose, the least kind of controversial way of reviewing individual performance. What's becoming more common and is somewhat more controversial is what you'll all be familiar with as a 360 review, where each board member is asked to rate their fellow board members across a range of areas. This is all done totally anonymously, so we then take the output of that. We create an average rating that has been received for each board member, and we present that back to, again, the company secretary. That is something that this is becoming more common, but it risks being a little bit personal, and it risks creating some division on the board. But again, it can be a very effective way of highlighting areas where specific board members are perhaps not contributing. So there are a couple of different ways of reviewing individual performance. I think if it's the first time you're doing it, certainly for the first few years, I would probably go with the approach of asking board members to rate their own contribution to the board. I think on the whole, board members are mature enough and professional enough to do that openly and honestly without kind of being too self-congratulatory. But maybe in subsequent years, when the board are more comfortable together, doing something like a 360 review and asking people to comment on the performance of their peers can be quite effective too.
We have time for final question, if they any. The question is, are the company secretaries you have dealt with in-house or external outsourced service providers?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and it's again, this is a definitely an emerging trend here in the UK, and increasingly, we as a company are engaging with external kind of outsourced company secretaries. So it's not that common, I would say. At the very most, it would be under 10% of our clients we are engaging with an outsourced company secretary. I think, when I consider the difference between engaging with an in-house versus an outsourced secretary, I mean, clearly, and it goes without saying that an in-house company secretary will have a more in-depth understanding of the company and is probably a better source of information about key themes and to give us real insight into what's going on. But then again, an outsourced company secretary will have a far better understanding of wider practices in the market. So there's one outsourced company secretary I'm working with at the moment, and I think she is the secretary to maybe 4 or 5 different big listed boards, and she is in a position to kind of share best practice with us and with her 5 boards, which perhaps the in-house company secretary isn't able to do.
Okay, I'm checking the chats. My final question for everyone, for you, so that you can share with all of us, is what happens after the evaluation? Does Linstock get involved, or is it up to the chairman of the board, or the company itself to act upon it?
I think with an external review, so a review when you are engaging an external party, we as a firm think it's very important for the external facilitator to be independent of their recommendations. So what we will do is make a number of recommendations to the board and to the chair and to the company secretary. But at that point, it's really up to the board to judge and decide which recommendations are appropriate, which ones they want to take forward. and it's up for the board and the company secretary to implement those recommendations. If Linstock gets too involved in the implementation of recommendations, it risks compromising our independence. You can also imagine yourself being in a situation where you perhaps charge additional fees for certain services. So this is, I think, one of the big reasons why the executive search firms have stepped away from this area, because I think very often they were making recommendations that particular profiles and board members were appointed to the board, and then they were charging fees to complete those mandates. So I think it's very important that external firms are not involved in implementation of recommendations, purely so that their recommendations can be totally free from bias and independent. What I do think is important, though, is that the external facilitator is there and is available for at least 12 months after the review to provide ongoing kind of ad hoc guidance and support the board and to share experience from elsewhere. That shouldn't be a case of doing the review and then disappearing for 12 months. External facilitators should be there to provide support, but shouldn't necessarily be involved in the implementation of recommendations.
With that, I'd like to call the webinar to a close. I would normally, if we were face-to-face, ask the audience to applaud you for waking up early, coming into office at 8:30, and then sitting around from 9 to 10. Thank you so much. I'll ask Ming now to close off the the chat, and thank you. We look forward to having a discussion with you in the future, and we'll be talking to you about what materials you could share with the group. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.